Hi there, welcome along to Language Open Learning, our online English grammar course. Today's lesson we're going to be talking about the present tense. Now this is the second part of the English grammar present tense. Now with the present simple tense we can use what's called adverbs of frequency. Now an adverb of frequency explains how often something happens. Now generally, the most popular ones, there are about 6 of them which we'll go through. Now the first one is, you've probably heard it, is always. Now if you can imagine on a percentage level, always would happen 100% of the time. It happens all the time. So always. For example, I always get up at 6:30 a.m. I always get up at 6:30 a.m. So we've got always. The second one that we'll look at is often. Often. Now if always is 100%, often would be 80% of the time. And we can use it, for example, I often go to the football match. I often go to the football match. So often is maybe about 80% of the time. The third one that we'll look at is usually. Usually. Now always is 100%, often is 80%, usually is probably about 60% of the time. So we can use the word usually in a sentence such as, it usually rains when I go on holiday. It usually rains when I go on holiday. So number 4, we'll look at number 4 is sometimes. Sometimes. Now sometimes can be used maybe about 40% of the time. Something happens about 40% of the time. So that's sometimes. And we can say, sometimes I eat pizza for lunch. Sometimes I eat pizza for lunch. Number 5 is rarely. Rarely. Okay? Rarely we would use for an event that happens maybe 20% of the time. Rarely. For example, we can say, Peter rarely listens to the radio. Peter rarely listens to the radio. And the last one we'll look at is the word never. Never. Now, never we would say happens 0% of the time. 0% of the time. So we can say my bus never arrives on time. My bus never arrives on time. So the 6 adverbs of frequency, or the most popular ones we'll look at, are always, which is 100% of the time. Often, which is 80%. Usually, which is 60%. Sometimes, about 40%. Rarely, 20%. And never is 0%. Now notice when we are using the adverbs of frequency that the adverb comes before the main verb. Okay? So the adverb of frequency comes before the main verb. So for example, I am usually late. I am usually late. So late being the main verb. Other frequency adverbs that we can use are frequently. Frequently, so that's about 80% of the time. Normally, about 60%. Occasionally, about 40%. Seldom and hardly ever would be maybe 20% of the time. So seldom, hardly ever would be about 20%. So the other adverbs of frequency that we can use would be frequently, which is about 80%. Then we've got normally, which is about 60%. Occasionally, 40%. And seldom, hardly ever, would be about 20% of the time. Now we'll look at state verbs and action verbs. There's two different types of verbs. We've got state verbs and action verbs. A state is when something usually stays the same. A state is when something usually stays the same. And an action is when something usually happens. So a state is when something stays the same. An action is when something usually happens. So for example, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Now, know is the state verb. We can't say, I am knowing what you are meaning. We can't say that. We say, I know what you mean. It stays the same. So, examples of state verbs. I'll just run through a few for you. We've got senses is the first example. That is appear, appear, hear, look, like, see, and taste. So the first one is the senses. That's appear, hear, look, like, see, and taste. The second one is feelings. Feelings, when we're talking about verbs of feelings. We can say like, hate, love, prefer, want, and wish. Okay, so that's feelings. Feelings, like, hate, love, prefer, want, and wish. Other state verbs would come under the category of thinking. Thinking. So, for example, agree, agree, believe, forget, know, think, understand. So these would be under the category of thinking. Agree, believe, forget, know, think, understand. The next one is possession. Possession. We can say verbs that come under the possession category would be belong to, contain, have, own. So these would be possession. Yeah, possession. Belong to, contain, have, own. The next one is being, category of being. Couple of verbs would be, for example, be, the verb to be, and the verb to exist. These would be being. And any other ones would be perhaps cost, the verb to cost, to depend on, to mean, and to need. So these categories are adverbs, are verbs of state or state verbs. So remember, there's senses, there's feelings, there's thinking, there's possessions, there's being, and a couple of other ones. Some of the verbs that I've just mentioned can have a state meaning and also an action meaning though. Okay? So examples are be, have, taste, and think. So for example, we can say, I have two sisters, which is a permanent state. I have two sisters. But we can also say, I'm having problems with my computer. And this would be a temporary action. Okay? So some of the verbs that I mentioned before, although they're state verbs, can also have an action meaning at the same time. So for example, I have two sisters, which is a permanent thing. And we can also say, I am having problems with my computer, which is a temporary state. Sometimes state verbs can also describe temporary feelings. Sometimes state verbs can also describe temporary feelings. So for example, how are you getting on with your English lessons? How are you getting on with your English lessons? And you can reply, I hate it, or I'm hating it. Or I love it, or I'm loving it. So sometimes state verbs can also describe temporary feelings. So when to use the present simple or the present continuous? When can we use them? Well, if you compare these, we use the present simple if something's permanent. We use the present simple if something's permanent, and the present continuous if it's temporary. We use the present simple if it's a habit or a routine, and we use the present continuous if it's in progress now. The present simple are for facts that are always true, and the present continuous is events that are happening at the moment. And we also use the present simple for general situations, whereas we use the present continuous for a particular situation. Okay, so I'll go through that again. The present simple is for something that's permanent, for habits and routines, for facts that are always true, and for general situations. We use the present continuous, though, if something's temporary, if it's in progress now, if it's the events are happening at the moment, and for a particular situation. So I'll give you an example. I live in Scotland. I live in Scotland. So this happens all the time. I live in Scotland. So we use the present simple. I'm living in England. I'm living in England. Now this is for a few months, so this is temporary. Okay, so I live in Scotland, which is permanent. It happens all the time. Whereas I'm living in England is temporary. So we use the present continuous. We can say this aeroplane lands in Madrid. This plane lands in Madrid, which is a routine. So we use the present simple. This plane lands in Madrid, which is a routine, present simple. But we can say we're landing in Madrid. We're landing in Madrid. So this is in progress now, so we use the present continuous. We're landing in Madrid, present continuous. So the present continuous has future meanings, as we've mentioned in a previous lesson. So what are the future meanings? Well, it can be used to describe a fixed future arrangement. A fixed future arrangement. And there is usually a future time expression. So the present continuous can be used to describe a future fixed arrangement with a time expression. For example, Peter is leaving early tomorrow morning. Peter is leaving early tomorrow morning. Or we can say my parents are buying me a mountain bike for my birthday. My parents are buying me a mountain bike for my birthday. So the present continuous and a future time event. It's common when we usually describe social arrangements. This is when we really use it the most. For example, are you doing anything on Saturday? Are you doing anything on Saturday? Are you doing anything on Saturday? And we can reply, yes, I'm going to the football match. I'm going to the football match. So that's the future meanings with the present continuous. So if we look at it again, there's a few other things that we look at. For example, the word feel. There's almost no difference between the simple and the continuous when we use the verb feel. For example, we can say, I feel awful. I feel awful. Or we can say, I'm feeling awful. I'm feeling awful. Both are exactly the same. I feel awful. I'm feeling awful. Or we can say, how do you feel now? How do you feel now? Or we can say, how are you feeling now? How are you feeling now? How do you feel now? How are you feeling now? Both are exactly the same. Also with the present continuous, we can ask ourselves, can we use the present continuous or the present perfect continuous? Now we'll look at that later on, but we'll cover it just now a little. For example, we can say, Amy is staying with Emma. Amy is staying with Emma, the present continuous. Amy is staying with Emma. So this means it's in progress now and it will continue. Okay, so Amy is staying with Emma. In progress now and it's going to continue. We can also say Amy has been staying with Emma since March. Amy has been staying, the present perfect continuous, has been staying with Emma since March. So this is in progress up to now, but it may or may not continue. We don't know. Okay, so the present continuous or the present perfect continuous, present continuous, Amy is staying with Emma, in progress now and it's continuing. Or we can say the present perfect continuous, Amy has been staying with Emma since March. It's in progress now, but we're unsure whether it's going to continue. Using the present continuous with always. Now we can use always with the present continuous when we are exaggerating or complaining or emphasizing. We always emphasize the word always in this speech. So when we use the word always with the present continuous, it means that we are exaggerating or complaining or emphasizing. But when we say it, we do emphasize the word always. So for example, we can say, you're always forgetting your key. You're always forgetting your key. So we emphasize the word always, okay? You're always forgetting your key. When we're talking about the present simple in narratives, for example, we can tell a story or a joke in the present simple tense, even though it means something that happened in the past. Okay? So this is when we're telling a story or perhaps a joke. Even television programs, if they do a catch-up from the previous program, they will use the present tense in their narratives. So I'll give you an example as a joke. A man walks into a bar and the barman says, so we're in the present simple tense. A man walks into a bar and the barman says, even though this isn't happening now, it's just in general. Okay, and it was probably in the past. We can also say, for example, if you listen to television narratives, what they'll say is, the story so far, Michael meets Susan in the library and tells her about the missing earrings. So this would be a narrative for a television program, for example. So the story so far, Michael meets Susan and in the library and tells her about the missing earrings. So that's all for this lesson. Thanks very much for watching. And if you go to our website, if you're on the website just now, you'll see a green button at the bottom of the page. Just click that and you can now take the present simple or the present tense test to see how well you get on. So thanks for watching. This is Ajar Ken for Language Open Learning. Thanks. Bye-bye for now.